প্ৰিয় শিক্ষাৰ্থীসকল, কৃষ্ণকান্ত সন্দিকৈ ৰাজ্যিক মুক্ত বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ৰ বিদ্যায়তনিক দৃশ্য শ্ৰাব্য অনুষ্ঠানটিলৈ আপোনালোকক স্বাগতম জনাইছো। স্বয়ংপ্ৰভা DTH চেনেল 20ৰ যোগেদি শিক্ষাৰ্থীসকলৰ অধ্যয়ন কাৰ্য অধিক মনোগ্ৰাহী আৰু ফলপ্ৰসূ হোৱালৈ লক্ষ্য ৰাখি বিভিন্ন বিষয় সামৰি আমাৰ এই বিদ্যায়তনিক অনুষ্ঠানটি সজোৱা হৈছে। আহকচোন প্ৰিয় দৰ্শকসকল, আমাৰ আজিৰ খণ্ডটিৰ মাজলৈ আগবাঢ়ো।
Hello learners, welcome to the audiovisual program on the course titled Poetry, included in second semester Bachelor of Arts in English program. I am Dr. Chayanika from the discipline of English, Padmanath Gohainbaruah School of Humanities, Krishnakanta Handik State Open University. This video deals with unit number 11, which is titled Introducing Indian English Poetry. Please note, dear learners, that this is the first of the 2 video lessons on this unit. Well, what does the term Indian English poetry signify? To deal with this question, we have to first gain an understanding of Indian English poetry in general. For that reason, this video shall aim at the following objectives: to provide you with a basic idea of Indian writing in English, to acquaint you with pre-independence Indian English poetry, and to reflect on the important points who have contributed to the development of pre-independence Indian English poetry. The term Indian English poetry encompasses within its scope all such works of poets who are Indians writing in the English language. It must be noted that literature in English was produced in India much earlier. In fact, it dates back to second half of the 18th century. The poetry inspired by the Indian landscape and culture was called Anglo-Indian. These Anglo-Indian poets were British people who, through their poems, had shared their experiences about India. It was in the later part of the 19th century that Indian poets like Henry Louis Vivian Derozio literally came out, taking English as their medium of expression. Earlier termed as Indo-Anglian to mark the Indian writing in English, Indian English poetry can be best understood by dividing the works of poets as pre-independence and post-independence poetry. And as mentioned previously, even before independence, there were writers like Henry Louis Vivian Derozio who had composed poems on various Indian sentiments, establishing himself as the first Indian English poet. He initially served as a lecturer in Hindu College of Calcutta, but later dismissed from service on grounds of misleading the students with his skeptical nature and reformist ideas. Within the short span of his poetic career, he contributed 2 poetry collections, which were named as Poems, published in 1827, and The Fakir of Jahangir, a metrical tale and other poems, published in 1828 respectively. Derozio as a poet was much influenced by Byron and the Romantics. When we glance through Derozio's poetic output, we find that the relevant themes in his poetry are patriotism, love for Indian myths and legends, and a strong Indian sentiment. Apart from Derozio, there were several other poets who contributed to pre-independence Indian English poetry, namely Kasi Prasad Ghosh, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, Govind Chandra Dutt, etc. However, it was Toru Dutt who had significantly raised the stature of Indian English poetry with her authentic flavor. One can see a strong influence of English romanticism in her works. Toru Dutt's A Sheaf Gleaned in French Field, published in between 1856 to 7, became very popular. Her poems like Our Casuarina Tree, The Lotus, etc. showed a strong resemblance to the poetry of English Romantic poets. Her themes, therefore, mostly include love, nature, longing for the past, etc. It is important for us to remember her as the first Indian women poet who could make a mark in the field of poetry with her distinguished sense of simplicity and sincerity by writing in a foreign language, that is, English. Next, in the history of Indian English poetry, the contribution of Sri Aurobindo is remarkable. Some of his poems are Love and Death, Ahana, Baji Prabhu, etc. He has to his credit numerous translated works like The Hero and the Nymph, Songs of the Sea, etc. His most popular work is Savitri, a narrative poem consisting of about 24,000 lines. One of the significant women poets contributing to pre-independence Indian English poetry was Sarojini Naidu, who had made her mark through her poetry. Her first published work of poetry was The Golden Threshold, which appeared in 1905. The Bird of Time, published in 1912, is her second collection of poetry. She had penned down many songs and was considered as the Nightingale of Indian song, as quoted by Iyengar. She matured as a poet with each poetry collection, and her last collection, titled The Broken Wing, had seriousness of tone. Actively participating in the then politics of the country as well as fighting for women's causes, Sarojini Naidu was a gifted speaker. She had dedicated poems to Gandhi and Jinnah also. They were some of the notable poets who wrote before independence. To sum up, it must be noted that Indian English poetry has been emerging ever since its beginning in the late 18th century. From Anglo-Indian poets to poets of Indian origin, Indian English poetry has seen tremendous growth in its output. Earlier, it was imitative of the West, but gradually it has strengthened its base by producing many authentic works. Among the pre-independence poets, some names like Derozio, Toru Dutt, Sri Aurobindo, Rabindranath Tagore, Sarojini Naidu, etc. are worth mentioning. Following are a list of books which you can refer to in your learning process. Thank you.
UGC, DV and Government of Assam recognized PhD, MPhil, Masters, Bachelors, Diploma and Certificate programs with online learning facilities, brought to you by Northeast India's first and only state open university, Krishnakanta Hendik State Open University. Education beyond barriers. For admission and all other information, visit www.kkhsou.in and subscribe for admission alert.
Hello learners. Welcome to the audiovisual program on the course titled Poetry, included in second semester Bachelor of Arts in English program. I am Dr. Chayanika from the discipline of English, Padmanath Gohainbaruah School of Humanities, Krishnakanta Hendik State Open University. This video deals with Unit 11, which is titled Introducing Indian English Poetry. Please note, dear learners, that this is the second part of the video lesson on this unit. In the first part of the video lesson on this unit, we have been acquainted with the idea of Indian English poetry in general, chiefly reflecting on pre-independence Indian English poetry, the poetic output and major themes dealt with by the important poets. In this video, we shall look at the following objectives. Analyze the significance of Indian English poetry in the contemporary literary setup of Indian writing in English, and gain an idea of the major poets who contributed towards Indian English poetry after the independence. After independence, the poets who had contributed towards the development of Indian English poetry are K.K. and Daruwala, Nissim Ezekiel, Dom Moraes, Kamala Das, A.K. Ramanujan, Arun Kolatkar, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Jayanta Mahapatra, Adil Jusawala, Bikram Seth, etc. to name a few. It must be noted that, quote, the English poetic tradition came to India on the path laid down by Macaulay's Minute of 1835, trailing clouds of literary glory, unquote, from Mehrotra's A Concise History of Indian Literature in English. Unlike the earlier poetry, which was more dependent on Western themes and was imitative, the poetry after independence was modern in its outlook. With his poetry volumes like A Beginning, Poems, The Brass Serpent, etc., Dom Moraes was one of the first poets to have made a mark. His poetry was confessional as well as realistic. One of the most notable Indian poets writing in English is Nissim Ezekiel. Emerging as one of the first poets to have a voice of his own in poetry, Ezekiel wrote in an age when patriotism and nationalism were intensified in the society. However, the poet broke those shackles and focused on urban themes and urban life. He showed the other emerging Indian poets their way through his mass involvement with printing, starting magazines, promoting new poets, and so on. The most significant aspect of his poetry is his expression of personal feelings in a diction that is precise and overt. His poems are a record of his struggles to come to terms with his own self. He has authored several collections like A Time to Change, 60 Poems, The Unfinished Man, The Exact Name, Hymns in Darkness, and Poster Poems, to name a few. Jayanta Mahapatra was one of the Indian poets who became popular both in India and outside. Winner of many international and national awards, Mahapatra was a teacher of physics. It is significant that he wrote and published poetry at a very later age in his life. Mahapatra's poetry reflects his inner self, which is very much rooted in India, more particularly in Orissa. His poetry shows influence of the West, especially the 20th century poets like G.M. Hopkins, Ezra Pound, etc. However, the most important feature of his poetry that distinguishes him or his works from the earlier poets is the diversion of themes. Unlike earlier poetry, his works bear a strong personal voice. Themes like love, lust, discontentment with prevailing customs, vision of Indian nest, reflection of stark realities, etc., mark his poetry as modern. Since his poetry is rooted to the Indian tradition, hence they are difficult to be read in isolation. His works are chiefly written in a particular social and cultural context. He is credited with 7 books written in Oriya and 20 books in the English language. It must be noted that he was one of the Indian poets who received Sahitya Academy Award for poetry written in English language. Some of his works are Swayamvara and Other Poems, Close the Sky 10 by 10, A Father's Hours, A Reign of Rights, Relationship, etc., to name a few. Kamala Das, another bilingual poet, has contributed greatly to the changing trends in Indian English poetry with her confessional poems. Her poems are an echo of her individuality and an expression of her feminine sensibility. The most notable work by another famous poet, Vikram Seth, is The Golden Gate, published in 1986. KK Daruwala's Relationship and Temple are worth mentioning in the context of modern Indian English poetry. Hence, it can be said that these poets, with their originality and confessional mode, broke the stereotype and garnered the future of Indian English poetry in a fruitful manner. One of the representative women poets is Eunice D'Souza. Her poetry depicts the Goan way of life with utter sincerity. Her published works are Fix, Women in Dutch Painting, Ways of Belonging, and Selected and New Poems. Her poetic mode is also confessional in tone. What is significant is the way she draws materials from her personal experiences and merges them to a general cause. Her poetic brilliance lies in transporting the readers from a particular to a general context. The language that she uses is colloquial and depicts her emotions vividly. Like Kamala Das, D'Souza also uses poetry as a medium of expression of her inner turmoil and frustration. Known for his poetry collections titled The Striders, Relations, Second Sight, etc., A.K. Ramanujan established himself as one of the finer poets and carved a significant place in Indian English literature. He writes both in Kannada and English. Apart from being a poet, Ramanujan was a translator. It was through his translations from Tamil and Kannada languages to English language that opened up to the readers from the West an idea about Indian sensibilities and provided a fascinating retreat to the traditions of India. Ramanujan's poetry is known for his art of craftsmanship. Poetically, his works are rich in imagery and ironic in tone. His uniqueness lies in his artistic balance, his quest for the self, and the juxtaposition of traditional with the modern. Few of his poems are Love Poem for a Wife, Part 1, The Hindu, Self-Portrait, etc. To conclude, this video familiarized you with the post-independence poets who have contributed a lot towards the growth of Indian English poetry through their experimental attitude and newer techniques. Chief among them are A.K. Ramanujan, Jayanta Mahapatra, Kamala Das, Nissim Ezekiel, etc., to name a few. Here is a list of books which you can refer to in order to acquaint yourself with the idea of Indian English poetry. Thank you.
ইমান সময় আমি স্বয়ংপ্ৰভা DTH চেনেল 20 যোগে সম্প্ৰচাৰিত কৃষ্ণকান্ত সন্দিকৈ ৰাজ্যিক মুক্ত বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ৰ বিদ্যায়তনিক অনুষ্ঠানটিৰ আজিৰ খণ্ডটি উপভোগ কৰিলো। এই বিদ্যায়তনিক অনুষ্ঠানটিৰ জৰিয়তে শিক্ষাৰ্থীসকল নিশ্চয়কৈ ভালেখিনি উপকৃত হৈছে। পুনৰ আন এটি বিষয় লৈ আমি আপোনালোকৰ মাজলৈ আহিম। নমস্কাৰ।